Dan, whoa. We're finally doing it. We'll get into that in a second. I'm stoked. I'm finally stoked. I don't know. What we got any banner we want to do before we jump into this? What do we want to talk about? My potatoes finally sprouted. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, exciting.
Very exciting. I think that's what they are. I went back today, and some of the leaves were like kind of starting to like fall off and die, and I was like, oh, it must be too cold. So I had to cover them up today. I covered them with a little blanket, and hopefully they'll survive, because it's, tell you what, it's still cold here, Dan. My potatoes. Well, they're finally here, but oh goodness.
Godspeed and God bless.
Godspeed and God bless. The common potato, the best food, perhaps. You know what I was thinking, actually, today, which I feel like you'd appreciate this. You know what's making a running for possibly the best food? Hummus. It's getting up there.
Nice.
Hummus is pretty damn good.
Yeah, I'm a fan.
I found myself being like, whenever I make meals, I'm like, what can I make to just put hummus on? Can I just put hummus on a potato? I don't know. Can I put it on spinach? Sure, why not?
It's the other way around. It's not you make a meal and then consider whether you could put hummus on it.
Exactly. Like, can I put hummus on Wheaties? I don't know. Would that make sense?
Yeah, mashed potato. I put on mashed potato a lot.
Wow, that sounds good.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Hummus and mashed potato, you say? Interesting. Do you remember? Do you remember that time that my mind was blown about the fact that you could use garbanzo bean juice as like an egg white substitute? And I was like really excited, and I told you, and you were like, wow, Jack, I had no idea. I was like, oh, yeah, okay, whoa.
Yeah, I remember trying to affect some level of sarcasm. I'm not quite sure whether it was on quite the level that you've just demonstrated.
Sure, that was a bit of an exaggeration. That's the vegan. That's like day one. They tell you that. It's like, you can do what with what? I always thought that was just water.
Anyway,
I
don't think this banter's going anywhere.
I don't think this banter's going anywhere.
We haven't got the energy for like, we can't like feign excitement in the sort of mundanity of our sort of chat.
The vegan
like,
cheese.
Yeah.
Tell you what,
sometimes
Dan.
like the pre-podcast banter is designed to sort of like soften people up, for then we're gonna hit them with all the sort of boring like, but like, I don't know.
I think
there's nothing boring in this episode.
There is not.
It's just one big hit after another.
Okay.
We're hyped and we can't like, yeah.
Okay. I'm close to standing up. Longtime listeners will know, old heads, one might say, that Dan and I, since a very early episode, have been teasing a book called The Book. And when I say Dan and I, it's mainly just been me.
It's just Jack.
I read this book last summer, kind of on a whim. I saw it in a local bookshop, and I was like, yeah, I'll pick that up. That looks interesting. The book is The Devils Chessboard, which is kind of a lame name, I'll be honest. And it's written by a guy named David Talbot. And it is ostensibly, at least the bit that we're reading right now, we're not reading all of it because there's just too much in it, but ostensibly it's history of the CIA. But I think kind of what it winds up being is a biography of Allen Dulles.
Yeah, I keep calling it a biography of the CIA.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. It's that story of like, maybe like the organizations that would go on to become the CIA up to, I don't know, 1963 maybe? We'll just use that as an end date. Why not? An arbitrary date. Maybe like November. I don't know. But so yeah, early CIA years, and how that famed institution has gone on to become one of the worst, I suppose, and its role in world history. But really, this book just serves as like a collection of nuggets that are just blow your mind, and that's why I love it.
Yeah, I mean, it's really wonderfully written, and it sort of like develops all of these. It's just developing a sort of meta narrative whilst also introducing these cast of scoundrels.
Yes,
and then sort of drip feeding to you nuggets of their biographies, which reveal themselves to be, the most duplicitous, the most deranged in some cases, the most psychopathic.
Yes,
the most amoral.
Preach.
Just a collection of the people you could ever fear to encounter.
Yes. Not good dudes, I think we can say.
No.
I mean, Wow. How do we start? I've been wanting to talk about this book for a long time, and I finally forced Dan to read it. What we're gonna do is we're gonna talk about up until the chapter I believe called is it Scoundrel Time?
Yeah, well, maybe we'll do the Scoundrel Time. I read a little bit further after that, but yeah, it's basically up until sort of like 52, with the sort of like the electoral victory of Eisenhower, Eisenhower-Nixon.
Yeah.
Ticket.
I love
ticket.
that the chapter on Nixon is just simply called Scoundrel Time.
Yeah.
I think that's so good. Okay, don't want to get too ahead of ourselves. I've been trying to figure out how to come at this, all right? Because it is a bit of like a book when you're like, hey, I'm reading a book on CIA history. Maybe some alarm bells go off, especially in part 3, which we're not going to talk about. We're not going to talk about part 3 yet. We'll talk about that when we get to it. But I think Dan and I have actually had some conversations on how to approach this book, why we're reading it, et cetera, et cetera. And I think a couple things become apparent. I mean, I actually think the thing that this pairs best with that we've read so far is the Mike Davis, and we'll talk about why in a bit, because you can definitely do a bit of a class analysis with this book, or just about class interests. But also I think we're interested in kind of going after the question of like, what is a conspiracy theory? Because you hear a lot of libs kind of clump everything under the sun is a conspiracy theory if it's not the official narrative, right? And I mean, like, Dan and I are obviously not QAnon people. We're not like Sandy Hook was fake news people. But we do kind of want to maybe separate the wheat from the chaff a bit when it comes to our lovely CIA beautiful boys. And so I think we're going to do our best to treat this as a history and see what we come away thinking.
Quite, yeah. I think, you're quite right to set it up in that manner. One could certainly look at this book and this history, particularly the way this book is written, to sensationalize to some extent, to draw out or to highlight some of the types of stories that it highlights, kind of thing, and the kind of narratives it's attempting to weave. Certainly does. Is designed to appeal to sort of like a conspiracy narrative to some extent, and but and we are going to go there. So and also bear with us and give us a bit of space in the sense of like, as Jack says, we don't quite know. We'd like to start we'd like to spend some time parsing out what is and isn't a conspiracy theory, how they function, and sort of how we intend to regard them, I suppose. But also, we're going to have some fun.
We're going to have some goddamn fun.
That's
some, for sure.
Sort of third eyes wide open, kind of like, Yeah,
and it's funny, right? Because, I mean, there is also a section of the left that just is basically like everything is CIA.
Yeah.
And I think that it is...
Or the FBI.
Yeah, the FBI's CIA. I mean, I think that I'm half joking, I'm half not. I think that this book could use an analysis that is a little bit more, I dare say it, Dan, maybe Marxist. I'll let you know when I find some people who can do that, but we'll do our best. Okay, so no further ado, Dan, should we just both feet jump in? So this book, we're not going to start with the introduction. We're not going to go there yet because the introduction teases part 3 and we don't want to go there quite yet. Let's start off by talking about this fella, Allen Dulles. Every blue-blooded American has at least heard of or flown in and out of Dulles International Airport at least once. That's D.C., I think. I've been there, but I don't remember if it's D.C. Whatever. It's on the East Coast.
Which Dulles is it named for?
It is not named after Allen Dulles, actually. It is named after his brother, John Foster Dulles. So these fellas, these lovable fellas, Dan, I suppose that we should begin to frame this conversation as they're corporate lawyers, right? They work for a law firm called Sullivan Cromwell in between the 2 world wars, okay? John Foster Dulles is a bit more of a statesman. He's kind of remembered as being a behind the scenes. He was he Secretary of State, I believe.
Secretary of State for Eisenhower.
Yeah. But also just like
sort of like Republican grandee.
Yeah.
With a specialization in foreign affairs.
In anti-communism.
Preceding that.
Yeah.
Quite. Yeah.
Heavy anti-communism. He was like the anti-communist dude.
Eventually, although
Perhaps overshadowed by one person.
Yeah.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
Think of one or two notable people who, one deranged anti-communist,
One very
and
drunk man.
Yeah, well, one very drunk anti-communist. But I'm thinking of Alan Dulles was the first to really start sounding a slightly deranged warning horn for
Yes.
Fear of the Soviet Union.
Fear of the Soviet Union.
Sort of like
domino theory
fear of
bullshit.
Communist influence inside the
Fluoridation.
United States, but also across Western Europe.
Exactly.
A bug which was caught by his brother John Foster.
And then the country.
Quite. Yeah.
So I think it's important to frame this. I mean, when Alan Dulles kind of enters the historical narrative in some kind of meaningful ways after World War One, by which time he's actually already kind of old, right? And as I say, he's working for this Wall Street corporate law firm called Sullivan and Cromwell. Sullivan and Cromwell. Sullivan and Cromwell.
Jack just threw up a little bit.
Well, the Sullivan and Cromwell would go on to represent some of the most reprehensible activities known to man. But I think before we get to that, I've got to set it up just a little bit more. All right. So a little bit of a history lesson, Dan, and I might go off here a little bit. I might have to go off.
You have my blessing.
God bless. So, as we all know, we've all seen the photos after World War One of German families. You've seen photos of like little kids building doll houses out of like stacks of Deutschmarks, right? And we've seen photos of people like the Deutschmark was so useless because of inflation that people would like be using it to like as wallpaper in their houses, right? Using it for insulation. People's whole life savings were gone just to basically like pay for some food, pay for a meal. And the reason that happened is because of a little thing, Dan, known as the Treaty of Versailles. All right, in the Treaty of Versailles. I found out about this the other day, and this blew my mind. There's something called the War Guilt Clause, all right? That is Article 231. And this is kind of infamous, and I mean, like, at least in American schools, you learn a little bit about this, because it was something that was kind of put in a little bit, maybe not last minute, but as a bit of maybe an afterthought. And what it did was it said that Germany, it's just a couple sentences, and it said that Germany was responsible for all of the assets lost by the Allies during the entire war. And they would go on to basically like put a number on this, which was astronomical, completely baffling, right? It was like a number, I think probably if you did it in today's money, it would probably be like in the billions of dollars, right? It was something that like Germany probably wasn't about to be able to repay. So this opened up quite a bit of business opportunities for Americans, right? Because German investors were freaking out because their investments just were worth absolutely nothing because they had to pay back this absolutely astronomical sum. I think actually at one point our good friend of the podcast, John Maynard Keynes, basically saw that and was like, whoa, okay, this is impossible. Why are we making Germany pay back this much money? To say nothing of like whose fault the war was. Not to say that it wasn't Germany's, but like it was kind of everybody's fault. It was a bit of an imperialist war. But American robber barons had a bit of a plan, Dan. And these were like old school robber barons, right? These were like the Morgans, the Goulds, maybe not the Goulds, but like people like that, right? People who would actually use the phrase robber barons. People who this is like the last generation of people who would, in America, who would just straight up send Pinkertons in to just like murder Union guys when they were striking, right? They had a plan.
They handed that role off to official state agents.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. They had a plan, Dan, and I'm going to actually let David Talbot explain what this was, because he explains this plan from the point of view of Sullivan and Cromwell, who were representing a lot of these corporate interests, okay? So, he says, Dulles, and here he means Alan Dulles, knew many of the central players in the secretive Swiss financial milieu because he and his brother had worked with them as clients or business partners before the war. Sullivan and Cromwell, the Dulles brothers' Wall Street law firm, was at the center of an intricate international network of banks, investment firms, and industrial conglomerates that rebuilt Germany after World War I. And when he says rebuilt here, what he basically means is like stealing these investments for pennies and then basically, profiting off of that, helping to rebuild. Mm-hmm. Foster, the law firm's top executive, grew skilled at structuring the complex merry-go-round of transactions that funneled massive U.S. investments into German industrial giants like I.G. Farben, chemical conglomerate, and Krupp Steel. Anybody who knows anything about World War II knows that IG Farben, they were the people who made Zyklon B, among other things, which is the gas that was used in the concentration camps. And Krupp Steel, of course, built basically all of the panzers and things like that, all of the war materials. The profits generated by these investments then flowed to France and Britain in the form of war reparations, and then back to the United States to pay off war loans. So I think that basically sets up all of this story, because what's basically happening here is American private investors, old school robber baron guys, are going, oh, we can make a killing off of this if we buy this investment for really, really cheap, invest heavily in Germany, and then allow those profits to be sent back to France and Britain in the form of war reparations. And then basically, because the United States loaned money to the UK and to France and everybody, that money would then be sent back to the United States to pay off war loans. So I think that's something that's really, really important to note. And something that I think that Talbot doesn't get into here is the idea of like, perhaps there's a second reason why these corporate robber barons were doing this, why these American people are doing this. And Dan, I hate to say it, but I think it might have been to stop communism. I think a lot of these people knew which way the winds were blowing, and they perhaps, there was a bit of a Red Scare going on in the United States at the time. Everybody was kind of like, whoa.
This is in the 30s, you mean?
Kind of right after World War I, the 20s and the 30s.
Uh-huh. Oh, yes. Oh, yeah.
So, I mean, I kind of tend to see this as obviously just a way to make an insane amount of money. But through directly investing in companies like Krupp and IG Farben, it becomes pretty apparent that there was also the aim of building up a authoritarian state, more or less, to stop communism. Because there was really that was the way that it was going to have to happen. Uh-huh. And that obviously, that kind of happened. It kind of didn't. Obviously, the Soviets would be the ones to defeat the Nazis. But at the same time, didn't spread past East Germany. So I think that's just a long-winded way of saying that, well, I suppose I should also say that none of this stopped during the war. These people were all still playing both sides. And if you'd like me to rattle off a quick list, actually, of U.S. companies that were involved with Sullivan and Cromwell that Dulles helped, that actually worked directly with the Nazis during World War II. And Dan, let me know if you know any of these companies. Let me know if you recognize any of these names. Let me just say, I doubt any of these are still around, because there's no way they could be. There's no way they could be supplied.
Surely they got what was coming to them, right? All of this was revealed.
Of course.
Yeah, as soon as the full extent of the Nazi crimes was discovered.
And they, they
sort of great purge of
and they popped open the hoods of the Nazi trucks and the tanks, and they saw Ford sitting there, and they're like, that must be a different Ford. Yeah, okay. Yeah. So, I just said Ford was one of these people that was working with the Nazis to build up he was working directly with Hitler. Henry Ford.
You mean actually Henry?
Actually,
Ford
Henry Ford. Actually,
Henry Ford.
And Ford Motor Company. They produced military vehicles for the Nazis and also used forced concentration camp labor. They wouldn't be the only ones. Mm-hmm. There was also Chase Bank, who sold war bonds to the Germans. There was IBM, and I find this one particularly disgusting. They created the punch cards and the computing software that the Nazis used for their ethnic censuses to send people to concentration camps. Coca-Cola, this one's actually kind of particularly funny. They, before the war, were creating, and just right after the beginning of the war,
were... It's the Fanta stuff, isn't it?
I didn't know about this.
No, really? Okay.
They were creating, or they were just, selling Coca-Cola to the Nazi army, and then the American government was like, please don't do that. We keep finding Coke cans in these goddamn German camps. And so they just made Fanta to be their German wing to keep selling fucking soft drinks to the Nazis. I had no idea about that. That blew my mind.
I mean, it's gross to think that a soft drinks company could be central to American global capitalist reach.
But it also makes total sense.
Yeah.
It's also of course. There was also GM, who gave raw materials to the Nazi war effort. There was Kodak, who not only was making film, but also they're making detonators and things like that in their factories. There was Dow Chemicals, who straight up was just giving... Let me tell you something, Dan. I've never been to Germany, but I don't picture it as a very oil-rich nation. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think they had enough oil to just do what they did.
Coal, maybe, but...
Yeah, exactly. Dow gave the Nazis the technology to refine oil, to make it into gasoline, and then when they found out that they couldn't just do that, they basically started just working directly with IG Farben and other people like that. There was Standard Oil, who for the entire war was supplying something called tetraethyl lead, which is vital to the operation of the engines in all of the planes in the Luftwaffe, and without it, they wouldn't have been able to have an air force. So it's cool to know that Standard Oil could have stopped the war whenever they wanted, but they didn't, of course, because they're making a shit ton of money on both sides. And I should also mention that there was one... I don't really understand what these companies do. Like when you're in New York and you just see like a large building and it just has several names on the front. I guess it's a law firm. I guess it does a bunch of things. There was something called Brown Brothers Harriman. All right, Dan. And this was the American front company for a guy named Fritz Thyssen. I don't know. I wrote it down. I can't even read my own handwriting. Thyssen. He was known as the Nazis' financier. He funded Hitler's ride to power. He was basically the money guy. And Brown Brothers Harriman was the American front for that company that set up front companies so that Americans could donate money to the Nazis. All of those companies obviously still around. Brown Brothers Harriman as well. You might not know about them, but they're still hanging about. So I guess that's the first part of the story, right? Is American involvement with the Nazis. And when you think about World War II, as you know, someone like Howard Zinn did, where he's like, "God damn it, I'm going to go fight some fascists." I hesitate to maybe not call him a commie, but he was commie adjacent, and he was someone who's like, "I'm going to go kill some goddamn fascists in the name of the United States." Planes he was flying, the cars he was driving, the cars that his German counterparts were flying. Whatever you do with a car, maybe drive a car, planes that were flying, all being made by American companies, or at least with technology by American companies. And Allen Dulles was at the center of it with Sullivan and Cromwell. So that's the first bit of my spiel. Let me just wrap it up for you real quick, Dan. That war guilt clause that I mentioned. I'll give you two guesses, Dan, as to who wrote that clause. And I'll tell you, Dan, it was not Allen Dulles. Who's your second guess?
Was it one John Foster?
It was fucking John Foster Dulles. The guy who would go on to become the Secretary of State for Eisenhower was at the center of all of this money moving around and funding the Nazi war effort, and specifically wrote the war guilt clause to open up Germany to American investment. I read that and my mind was just, my third eye just like burst from my head. I was like, are you fucking kidding me?
Yeah, I think one thing we're going to learn through this book is that whenever there's something dastardly going on, you just have to have a look under the nearest rock, and there will be a Dulles.
There will be a Dulles, or there will be a fucking Brown brother,
or
a Harriman.
Some representative of the Dulleses, one of their agents, of some sort of other, probably a future president, hanging around somewhere nearby. That's the one thing that I discovered from this. I mean, it should have been totally obvious to me, but as an outsider to American politics, like, I know some of these names of people who have some period of time where their actions are connected with some degree of infamy.
Sure.
But really, if you look at the biography of these people, like, it's infamy all the way down.
It is just
like,
infamy all
at
the way
any
down.
point in their career, it's just the same kind of like, just dastardly activity.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's funny, right? Because I think that one of the things that we're also looking at in this is like, well, what use is all of this to some kind of left, right? What use is this history to the left? I'm of the mind, obviously, that it's of quite a lot of use. We can kind of talk about that later once we get more of the story. But I mean, like, if you're to be exposed to all of this in an apolitical way, you're going to wind up, at best, I think, well, at best, you're going to become a communist. But that's not a lot of people. You're going to become one of these, like, kind of like 1% is bad people. Because you kind of look at this and you go, oh my God, it was just all the same people. Allen Dulles' reign went from like the end of World War I all the way up until like the 60s. And it's really easy to just go, this isn't a function of the system. This isn't the system operating as it should. This is an anomaly, right? And so I think that, like, one of the important things that we need to keep in mind, and when we're looking at this, is like really kind of trying to shape the narrative for what it is that this is the system operating exactly as it should, and that after World War I, which was maybe you could say the last kind of gasp of like an imperial royalist or maybe just aristocratic thing, that the bourgeoisie came in and they were like, fucking, wait a minute, World War I, if we did that again, we could all make a ton of money. And they did, and they were playing both sides, and it worked like a dream.
Yeah, you're quite right to highlight that, because we are really at risk of falling into the trap of becoming very fixated on a few names and a few actors. And one thing we should bear in mind is to always look for what is their class interest, what collection of capital do they represent? Because as you say, like these are representatives of the sort of East Coast banking elite. And we've discovered other factions of capitalism sort of vying for power in American politics in other readings that we've done.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that's always the question. Like, what's the class basis of what's incentivizing them to take the actions that they're doing? Particularly, it speaks to something that here I am suggesting that we should focus on their class interests and not the persons involved, and then I begin to speak about the people involved immediately.
It's because it's a good story.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But what I was going to say was something about the character of these people is that they appear to represent. They will champion certain ideologies and certain political positions, but what stands behind that in most cases seems to be a strong amoral core.
Yeah.
All they're interested in is their own interest and the financial interests that they represent. Any amount of sort of vociferous anti-communism, say, will turn around immediately and protect anybody who might at one point fall foul of the sort of American witch hunt for communists in the 40s and 50s.
Sure.
And these characters will protect them because they have some kind of connection to them, some type of interest, blah, 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 kind of thing. And it's the same with like Dulles' actions. Well, here we are prior to World War One. I'm sort of transitioning us into World War One. I speak of Alan Dulles here, kind of thing. Like the degree to which he stifled the exposure of the true extent and scale of the Holocaust, the degree to which he hid that, wasn't motivated by some kind of like underlying Nazism. Not that he necessarily like disagreed. I'm sure he wasn't anti-Semite.
There was one bit though where he was like, I did read an interesting book today called Protocols of the Elder of Zion, and it's just like, oh my god,
I'd forgotten about that, and I would imagine that you would like to hinge some amounts of or to hang off of that some amounts of
anti-Semitism, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah, perhaps.
But yeah, what seems to be the central part of their character is just self-interest and class interest.
Absolutely.
Through and through. Kind of
And it's funny, right? Because I've been trying to come up with a way of like at this time period designating the Eastern like Wall Street banking establishment. I should say financial establishment. And it at that time, and we've seen this kind of fall apart around the kind of like Reagan time, where Mike Davis talks about like the Sun Belt bourgeoisie, the defense industry, all those new industries popping up to support him. This just kind of seems like the biggest of the big bourgeoisie. And I know that that's kind of like crass to say, but it's like, I get the feeling that not only can you say that just because of the amounts of money that they were producing, right? And that these were like the robber barons of the day, but like, I get the feeling that these people, this is where the charade of anti-communism stopped being anything other than that's a direct threat to my class interests. And they understood that. Maybe if you go down a couple rungs on the bourgeoisie, like, I don't know, someone who owns like maybe like the McDonald's guy I don't know anything about him, but like if he had any kind of anti-communist sympathies, it probably would have been more along the lines of like hysteria, like, oh my God, they're here to destroy our freedom. These people knew that that wasn't the case. They knew that it was purely just business interests, and we'll get to that kind of when we talk about what Alan Dulles did to the entire planet. But these people knew what they were doing, and they were acting directly in their class interests very consciously, and spinning this myth of anti-communism as being bad, and it's all this horrible stuff. So I suppose that's kind of why I say the biggest of the big bourgeoisie. Like these were like the big ass bourgeoisie. You know what I mean? So yeah.
Yeah, there's one thing. I mean, I don't know where this is going to go necessarily. One thing I've sort of spoke to you in the week about, looking back to that episode that we did on Davis. What was it called? The New Rights Road to Power?
Road to Power, yeah.
When we were sort of juxtaposing the sort of Sunbelt capitalists in the 70s that would eventually, sort of 60s and 70s that would eventually result in the Reagan presidency, and them being a group who unseated this, the sort of Eastern establishment, as it was normally referred. And from that reading, I got the impression that the Eastern establishment was to some degree or other, like, at least mild defenders of the sort of FDR legacy and the New Deal legacy kind of thing.
Yeah.
What shocked me about this, and we'll get onto it later, I suppose, was the degree to which it was after 45. Like, it was almost like an all-out pitch battle
Absolutely.
between the FDR legacy and this group that we're introducing now, kind of thing. The people around the sort of financial elite, around the Dulleses, people that were associated with the sort of with Eisenhower as well.
Yeah, because we hear about
and they outplayed this. They played the situation shockingly well.
Yeah.
And so really thoroughly sort of eviscerated any of the sort of like legacy, the lasting legacy of FDR. But we'll get onto that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point, because I think that we hear the phrase New Deal consensus tossed around a lot.
Yeah.
But all that really was popular support for the New Deal policies.
Yeah.
And it's like, obviously, there were New Dealers, ardent New Dealers in public office.
It would seem like any amount of New Deal consensus was basically a gradual unpicking rather than a sort of like swift decapitation kind of thing. Although it actually was quite a swift decapitation.
Yeah, it was pretty quick. Because
certain people were swiftly gotten rid of. I mean, perhaps that was the strategy, right? You get rid of certain influential people, and then you gradually erode the public's commitment to it after you've gotten rid of the sort of like key advocates, I suppose.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, there were definitely anti-New Dealers who benefited from the New Deal as well. So, I mean, you know, and like better infrastructure is that's good for us. Our trucks can go places, you know what I mean? So it is, I mean, it's a bit of both, because it seems extremely quick. I mean, I think that the New Deal consensus, we build it up as something big because it was relatively recently in our history.
Yeah.
But it's like from 1945 until Reagan? If that's where you want to end it, but like really Nixon? Like, you know what I mean? Although Nixon today, sadly, would be a pretty progressive Democrat in some respects. Yeah, so let's talk more about that idea. I'm going to read again from the Talbot, and this is, to set this up a little bit, this is Talbot trying to explain the degree to which, even as the New Deal was in place, even as FDR was in power, just how under attack it was, right? And so a fella named Henry Morgenthau, who was a bit of a New Deal fella, wheeler and dealer, goes to go see FDR to basically say some bad things are going to happen, maybe to you, but just to like all of us New Dealers if we don't do something about these people who are actively plotting against you, right? So Talbot says, in April 1945, Henry Morgenthau went down to the presidential retreat in Warm Springs, Georgia, where FDR was convalescing, to urge him to directly confront the State Department cabal that seemed hell-bent on appeasing the country's German enemies and antagonizing its Soviet allies. Sitting down for cocktails with the president, Morgenthau was shaken by the president's, quote, very haggard appearance. His hands shook so that he started to knock the glasses over. I found his memory bad, and he was constantly confusing names, end quote. After drinks and dinner, Roosevelt seemed to rally, and he asked Morgenthau what he had in mind. The Treasury Secretary told him that it was time to, quote, break the State Department and replace the old guard with loyal New Dealers, end quote. FDR assured Morgenthau that he was with them 100%. The next afternoon, April 12th, Roosevelt died after suffering a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Hate to laugh at the guy, but like, oh, that sucks. Damn, we were that close. Let's, as we like to do, let's do a little alternative history. Is there any world where Morgenthau's plan would have been successful, where it might have bought the New Deal some time, but I think that we really underestimate the degree that these big bourgeoisies fellas wanted FDR gone and wanted the New Deal gone in 1945. Like, we were still fighting the Nazis, and they're like, the Nazis, what have they done? You know what I mean? I have a hard time believing that anything could have been done.
Would have happened.
Yeah. I mean, it didn't. Obviously, FDR died, but like that plan died with him. So,
I mean, there are. I suppose areas in this book where it's hinted at that it could quite easily have been the Dulles group of sort of this cabal of people who ended up on trial in the 40s. As a result, the late 40s, as a result of their
treason.
I was going to say dealings with the Nazis, but
well, yeah, same thing.
Yeah,
I mean.
But I don't know whether I get more the impression it's kind of like a by rights thing than an actual plausible series of events that could have come about, I suppose.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, if we take it as a systemic problem, the answer is no. It wouldn't. FDR couldn't have just gone, we're going to have a softer version of capitalism, baby, and then not expect people, capitalists to not be like, no.
Yeah. But it was shocking to me looking over this period of time. One, I mean, it made good fodder for the sort of like socialist and communist, the communist witch hunts of the late 40s and early 50s. The fact that so many people who were sort of democratic politicians or took up significant positions in the FDR administration were people who had connections to the Socialist Party, who had avowed sort of socialist connections, had by contemporary American standards, had real legitimate left-wing credentials. I mean, the person I have in mind is Jerry Voorhees, right? Who is the person who we'll come on to in a little while, whose seat Nixon took from him in 46. But he's someone who was advocating for sort of quite sweeping nationalizations, advocating for a minimum wage.
Nationalizations of the oil industries, right?
As well as seeking to expose some of these sort of what you've just described as treasonous activities.
Nazis. American Nazis.
Some of these American Nazis. Someone who was a committed Democrat, but somebody who had been in the Socialist Party. And it's something to overlook when you look at contemporary America or the last half century of American history, I suppose, that there was this period of time where there was significant overlap between the Democrats and sort of representatives of labor, I suppose.
Sure.
So to discount that, at least as a political force that had some weight, would be premature, perhaps. But I mean, obviously, what the long-term alternate scenario may have been, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe the US might have ended up with a slightly more comprehensive healthcare system than it currently has at the moment.
I mean, that's what Nixon wanted, so probably
well,
not.
Yeah. Perhaps the New Deal legacy may have been more significant than it was in terms of more extensive government programs that might have been brought into existence, kind of thing. Sure. But you're entirely right to say that it would have suffered the same decline that social democracy suffered anywhere in the world, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, Talbot is very quick. Maybe it's just because he's a bit of a lib, but he's very quick to be like, Voorhees wasn't a communist. He wasn't a communist. Sure, he was in the Socialist Party, but he's, come on now. He wanted to nationalize things. That's it.
There's the point in time when he uses the phrase hardcore communist.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah.
Yeah, which is clearly coming from someone who doesn't have any, I mean, God bless him, and I guess fair enough, anybody, or maybe not God bless him, God bless anybody who manages to fill their brains with the necessary terminology to differentiate different types of communists in a meaningful way and continue to remain sane and willing to engage with politics in any meaningful way.
What do you think old hardcore communist means? Do you think that means council communist, or he's just he's in the SPD,
we actually look
hardcore.
at the footnote. By footnote, by hardcore communist, I actually mean a particular subset of council communists who adhere to a certain set of principles between 35 and 45, not to be mistaken by the Italian council communists,
or those fucking MLs
who were effectively sub-Leninists.
That would be amazing.
No, I don't think there's any kind of that degree of nuance.
Yeah. Let me hit you with probably what's going to be my last quote of the day, which is FDR talking with some person. But then Talbot goes on to talk about somebody named Mills, who's C. Wright Mills, who wrote a pretty influential book called The Power Elite, which is an attempt at a class analysis from someone who is not a communist. And that goes about as well as you think. But from what I can gather, it's a book that really tries to expose the movers and shakers of the United States who aren't elected and who are private people, right? So it starts out with a quote from FDR. It says, "The real truth," FDR wrote to Colonel Edward M. House, President Wilson's close advisor, "is, as you and I know, that a financial element in the larger centers has owned the government ever since the days of Andrew Jackson," end quote. For a brief period during the widespread devastation of the 1930s, the New Deal was able to challenge this plutocracy, as Roosevelt called it. Which, come on, Roosevelt, you're a bit of a, come on now. The Roosevelt presidency did not dismantle the power elite, Mills later wrote, quote, "But it did create within the political arena, as well as in the corporate world itself, competing centers of powers that challenged those of the corporate directors." And I think that's kind of what we're getting at, right? So it's like, okay, if FDR didn't just die immediately after that conversation, there definitely would have been alternate centers of power. And I mean, like, you know, again, as we've talked about, everybody who was so excited about Sanders, it was the same thing, but on a much smaller scale, right? It's like, just get some kind of class consciousness going, right? I mean, it's interesting to put yourself in someone's mindset back then in the 30s as the New Deal was, you know, going. Like, how did they perceive of history? You know what I mean? How did they perceive of the word Bolshevik? If you were like a union guy working at the docks in Seattle, like, how did you perceive of the word Bolshevik? How did you perceive of the Red Scare of the 1910s and the 1920s? It's interesting because from what I can gather, the American labor movement at that time was so reticent to be militant in a big way, right? I'm not sure what that speaks to. I don't think I could speak to that. But I mean, it's just strange because it's like these people were willing to put their lives on the line to like defend their families against Pinkertons. But I don't know. Obviously there were communists back then, but like trying to put yourself in that mindset is very difficult. And I don't want to apply historical hindsight, you know, so... It's
an interesting question to which I do not really have an answer. You do kind of get the impression that a lot of, well, obviously, like the effects and the aftermath of the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression were like catastrophic for America.
Sure.
And I think that you get the impression that like there was a great fear that like American society was really beginning into fracture and was really riven by this. And you really get, I sort of got the impression that FDR and the New Deal was an effort to hold the country together, almost.
Absolutely, yeah.
And obviously, like, organized labor was heavily involved in that. But what I don't really know is what other sort of like grassroots movement there was for that. I don't really know how big the socialist and communist parties were. I don't really know what their degree of influence was. I don't know whether something like the IWW was still in existence and on what level of strength it had, and sort of to what extent it there was an active working class movement that wasn't just a mass of people and their sort of formal representatives in government and in sort of the trade unions kind of thing. Is that the kind of like question you were pushing after?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know of one example. There were pretty massive strikes in around this time period in Seattle on the docks. That's why I brought that up. And there was at one point, I forget exactly where I read this, but at one point there was a dock worker who was interviewed by a paper who said 99% of us can agree that the system has to change, so we can't keep doing things like this, but none of us can agree on what that means. If that means militancy, if that means reforms, if that means joining a party, if that means not having a party, and it just kind of fizzled out from there into, oh, okay, we'll give you better working hours. You know what I mean? I suppose all that is to say, time period we should know more about.
Yeah.
Now let me hit you with something else, Dan. We talk about how, you know, we throw around this word Nazi, all right? We throw around this word fascist when we're talking about these people, the Herbert Walkers, the Harrimans, the Bushes, which, let's not get it twisted, Prescott Bush, Nazi. A lot of people probably know about this, but there was a fella named Smedley Butler, all right? And Smedley Butler was perhaps... I think he's always described as like the most decorated American soldier of all time, whatever the hell that means. I kind of don't really care. Well-respected guy. He fought in Cuba, sadly. He fought in probably some other places he shouldn't have fought. Might have fought in Mexico. I don't know. Really respected guy. He was kind of like he was like the mad dog of his time. You know what I mean? Supposedly, at one point, and when I say supposedly, I mean definitely, he was approached by...
When I say allegedly, I mean...
When I say allegedly, I mean he was approached by Prescott Bush specifically to put together a very large group of disaffected World War I veterans who were understandably very angry about the way the country that they had returned to. And this was a time when people were marching on Washington and sitting in the National Mall and being like, I have no house, I have no food. Everything is horrible. We need a change. And supposedly he was approached by a group of big capitalists. It's kind of implied that this was the Bushes, the DuPonts, all the good folks, to take this group of disaffected veterans, if he could, march on Washington under the pretense of, oh, FDR is too sick. Get him out of here. We need someone strong. We need a Smedley Butler. Put him in place ostensibly as a president and allow these kind of like big capitalists to rule in the shadows, I guess, so to speak. Basically to implement what would probably have gone on to be a Hitler-friendly nation. Smedley Butler goes, he like plays along for as long as he can, being like, yeah, sure, I'll do that. And then he goes to Congress and he's like, this is what's happened. This is insane. You guys need to arrest all of these people right now. Otherwise there's going to be a fascist coup. They listen to him. The case gets shut down. Nothing ever happens. Nobody ever gets arrested. And then Smedley Butler goes out and is like, records himself and is like, this is exactly what happened. I was approached. There was about to be a fascist takeover. And then goes on some kind of BS about like, as long as we have free speech, this country will be all right. Anyway, when we talk about like American capitalists selling stuff to Nazis and playing both sides, that's kind of one thing. But obviously this is something completely different, right? I mean, this was capitalists making an attempt at making the United States fascist. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's funny, right? Because this is something that a lot of libs will kind of brush away as being like, well, you know, since Congress never did anything about it, it's probably just crazy Smedley Butler, probably, you know, who knows? But like, this is something that, I don't know. I feel like the question that we're going to answer when we talk about this book going forward is, why did they not try it again? And I think that the answer is they didn't need to. No. It was just that they didn't need to, because they're able to find a way to get everything that they wanted, run the world as basically just one big business, and regime change all over the place, at home and abroad, without resorting to this kind of like literal coup. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a pretty vital part of history that the left maybe could use a little bit more.
Yeah, I didn't know anything about that. You've reminded me of something I remember reading in the early sections of this book, which I haven't gone back and read since. But there's a point in this book, I'm fairly sure, where the author is discussing the kind of like general anti-Semitic sentiments of various countries, and he's basically making the point there was nothing particularly unique about the level of sort of like anti-Semitism or the potential to inflame anti-Semitic sentiments in the United States was no different to the potential to do that in Nazi Germany kind of thing. Yeah. I think really what he's hinting at is in the minds of this certain selection of the elite, really. One of the things that has been made quite apparent to me is that we shouldn't imagine at this period of time national capitals or capitalist institutions or collections of capitalists existing within certain national borders. It wasn't one capital against another capital located in a set of national borders. Obviously, the connections were a lot more complicated, and I think. Obviously, I mean, it would be the most grotesque, like pro-American rhetoric to say anything counter to what I'm about to say. But to imagine that there was some kind of like virtuous United States against some sort of like paragon of evil Nazi Germany. Obviously, what happened in Nazi Germany was the pinnacle of evil, as I can imagine it. But there was no virtuous. Counterpoint to that.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I would like to give people, obviously, like the Howard Zinns of the world, and even just like your friendly, like, you know, grandpa who went to war. They thought that absolutely they were fighting fascism, and good for them. I mean, hell yeah, go fight fascism. That rocks. But like, the truth is that, you know, when you play, people are just playing both sides. And I mean, like, what you're totally right to say that there's this international approach to capital, which is like complicated in some respects, but then it's also like Brown Brothers, Harry Mann, Allen Dulles, and Fritz Thyssen. You know what I mean? It's like people who were like actively attempting to prop up Adolf Hitler. And it's, you know, it's just like, I don't know. It's the third eye. It's just like, oh my God. Because you always hear about people saying, you know, businessmen playing both sides. But then it's like, when you actually read the names of people who were building the companies that produced the gas to kill the people in the concentration camps and that they were Americans, it's like, if that doesn't just absolutely fry your mind and make you realize, oh, wow, you know, so big change absolutely needs to happen, then nothing will. You know what I mean? Because, you know, you only have to look at the war on terror or something like that to realize that things like this are absolutely still going on. So we'll imagine we'll get to there. Anything to say on that, or should we move on to the politics of the post-FDR world?
I developed the idea of a segue.
Oh, okay.
And
Hit me with it.
my segue was to propose to talk about one particular do-gooder who was exploited by a certain subset of nefarious actors.
Oh, I'm interested to hear about this.
But also, I wanted to re-highlight and also do a bit of a disclaimer. Jack has been very keen to both focus on the activities of certain individuals, but also put the activities of those individuals in a particular class context, which he is commended to have undertaken. Yeah. An activity I commend him for undertaking.
Oh, I commend you for commending me.
I can't but just get really bogged down in just some of the personal stories, some of the individual acts,
the neuroses,
some of the sort of like neurotic or psychotic actions,
or perverted in some cases. Let's be real.
There's a great deal of perversion going on.
We'll get the right cone.
There was a point when I was really like, this might well go over the heads of anybody that's not familiar with like the Lacanian school of psychoanalysis, but there's a little bit early on in this book when they're talking about the sort of like the family background of the Dulleses, and they're talking about an overbearing mother and a sort of absent father, and I was like, all my sort of like psychosis, alarm bells were going. Everything I know about like amateur attempts to use a psychoanalytic framework to diagnose people, I was like, so I'm curious of the particular psychological structures that might be at play in the heads of some of the Dulles offspring.
Can we just pause on the Jungian stuff for a second?
Yeah, I didn't read any of that, but if please don't, like, was it Alan Dulles' wife that was analyzed by
Jung? Yeah. And apparently, I went after this because it mentions Jung. Who's the other person that he psychoanalyzed? It was someone else. It was some other he was like, I'm interested in men of power, which is kind of gross. Well, while you're looking for that, there's an essay I believe that Jung wrote. I think it was Jung, about analyzing the personalities of Mussolini and Hitler, because apparently he was like at a dinner and like met both of them, which like I don't really know what dinner that was for his meeting these two people.
It says here that Dulles' wife Clover, but also his wartime mistress Mary Bancroft.
Oh my god!
Both his wife and his mistress. He had analyzed by Jung.
Something creepy about Jung doing that. I don't know. It's very odd. Anyway, he wrote some essay about trying to use archetypes to analyze Hitler and Mussolini. And he was like, listen, when I met Mussolini, you couldn't help but like the guy, which I think is really, really funny. He calls him like a tribal strongman, just the archetype of like, let's go kick some goddamn ass. Sure. Whereas Hitler, he was like, tell you what, got a bad vibe from this kid, which again, fair enough. But he talks about how Hitler was more of the like shamanistic archetype, which is, I think, really, really interesting, of this person who takes all of the paranoia and neuroses of an entire society and then takes them all upon himself and just creates something completely different, which is just this psychopathic rage. Would still like to know what that dinner was that Jung like met Mussolini and Hitler at. Sounds very odd. Anyway, I just want to talk about Jung.
So, Alan Dulles, stationed in Switzerland as an OSS sort of like station chief, I suppose, that sort of relishes the activity, is well into it, comes home in 1945 and goes back to working at his law firm. And all of his former collaborators, all of his wartime friends and allies, seem to think that their spying days are behind them. But
when you say wartime friends, obviously you're talking about some Americans, but you're not talking about Nazis, are you?
Some Americans, some Nazis, some legit Nazis, some people who were instrumental in aiding certain Nazis in escaping prosecution.
Karl Wolff, Reinhard Gehlen. Who's the other guy? Bond Man or something like? I don't know. Not Bond Man.
I don't know. Yeah, we've skipped over certain sort of like wartime
activities.
Okay, let's go over it quickly. I'm going to sort of ad hoc what I remember, and you'll have to chip in and fill in, kind of thing. As I recall, Alan Dulles, stationed in Switzerland, had cultivated certain relationships with certain influential Nazis. One of them, Karl Wolff, who was advisor to Goebbels or something. One of the one of the sort of like number 2, number 3 Nazis kind of thing. Wolff was sort of chief advisor to, but ended up stationed in Italy toward the end of the war. And basically, Alan Dulles was incredibly keen to protect these people, Wolff and some of his underlings in Italy, and he pulled basically every lever and every string he possibly could to keep them out of the dock at Nuremberg.
Yeah.
Wolff in particular really should have been one of the first collection of Nazis tried at Nuremberg, basically.
Sure.
And basically the only appearance he ever made at Nuremberg at any of the trials was to be a witness for the defense of some of the Nazis.
Jesus fucking Christ.
And although it was the official policy of the FDR and Truman administrations to, I guess, give low legal quarter to the Nazis and the rulers of Nazi Germany, basically they were all going to be tried for the crimes for which they were committed, which was kind of the first time in history where they'd endeavored to do this to the leaders of defeated countries. Ordinarily, like, there would be some leniency given, kind of thing. Certain overlooking of war crimes often went on.
Sure.
But Alan Dulles disagreed with this policy vociferously. Partly this was motivated, I think, by his very early fears that America was liable to enter very quickly into a conflict with the Soviet Union with a degree of warm hotness or coldness,
sure,
undetermined yet, but he thought that the Soviet Union posed this sort of grotesque threat to America and American interest.
Can I just say, on the note of the trials, who it was that actually said we should have trials? Because Churchill specifically was like, get all of the main Nazis and shoot them. Hang everyone you can. These people all need to die. FDR was like, yeah, sure, why not? And it was actually Stalin who was like, we should probably have a trial.
I'd forgotten about that. Yeah, although Stalin was a fan of a good trial.
Yeah, I know. A show trial.
Yeah, of course.
Nonetheless.
Although, yeah, maybe I'll try and remember that quote from Churchill. Every time people are quoting Churchill in future, it's like, yeah, hang and shoot all the Nazis.
Yeah.
As Churchill once said.
Yeah, as Churchill once said, I'm sick of living in this goddamn bunker. Kill all the Nazis.
I think Alan Dulles' sentiment was that some of these people, however dastardly and evil their deeds may well have been, were going to be necessary for the rebuilding of Germany. Who were they going to put in charge?
Yeah, certainly not Soviets.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or certainly not sort of like soft social democrats who might be swayed to sort of the Soviet cause kind of thing. No, we were going to have all these strongmen kind of thing who had fallen into the Nazi party, but really they were the legitimate rulers of this country. Yeah, as thought Alan Dulles. So yes, suffice it to say, Alan Dulles instrumental in the protection of certain Nazi war criminals, as he was obviously in the protection of certain Nazi wealth, both the wealth that was accrued by American companies through their dealings with Nazi Germany, but also various pools of money that were accumulated by various Nazis or people who collaborated with the Nazis, appropriated, stolen by certain collaborators with the Nazis who all sort of seemed to end up in the deposited in certain American bank accounts. All of their legal representation was done by certain American law firms.
I wonder which ones.
Anyway. And as we were alluding to also earlier, Alan Dulles quite instrumental, I think on several occasions during the war, of preventing certain communiques about the severe extent of, or the true extent of the Holocaust, for certain sort of tactical and strategic decisions of his own.
I forget, Dan, did I mention, when I was listing off those American companies, Did were any of them using forced labor concentration camps? I forget.
You
I
only
forget which
you
ones.
referred to it very briefly, but yeah,
The answer is yes.
So, something to highlight again.
Forward, baby.
Yeah.
And it's one thing that he was doing that, but it's also like the ways in which information was leaking out of Nazi Germany about the Holocaust was like, specifically there was one guy who like was in, I forget which concentration camp, but he was in a pretty brutal concentration camp, as concentration camps tend to be, and he managed to escape. He managed to, I think there was something like he had to hide in a wood pile for 2 days while Nazi guards were just like walking by shooting the shit. Escape, walk like a couple hundred miles across enemy lines to like put his report and to like find
literally into the
hands of Alan Dulles and be like, my family's dead, everyone I know is dead, they're killing millions of people, America needs to join this war right now, tell FDR. And he just threw the report in the trash, and this happened several times. It's hard to describe, it is like we wanted to have like a systemic approach and an analysis of the systems that created these people, but it's so hard not to be like, this guy was just evil. He was just purely evil. You know what I mean? It's like, well, my buddy's down in Wall Street. We're making some money off of Dachau. It's like, unbelievable.
I struggle not to think of him to some extent as somebody who I feel like had quite a sort of delusional attitude. Well, it was truthful in sense. It wasn't really a delusion kind of thing, but
that's the thing.
A sense of his influence and his importance, even when he wasn't the person who should be making the final decision. He always thought he was the person that should be making the decision and did his utmost to have like outcomes that he favored win out. And I find it very easy to look past simple sort of like economic interest, I suppose. Or one of the things that allowed him to do this was a certain, dare I say, perverse sense of self-importance and sort of self-aggrandizement. But anyway, I'm just sort of like speculating on people's psychology now. Which I'm obviously loath to do.
What are the 3 categories again?
Neurosis, perversion, psychosis.
I'm
more interested. Like, there are some characteristics of perversion which are kind of like a very personal understanding of the law and what's right and wrong. Which sort of like I would be willing to attach to Alan Dulles.
Might be the trifecta, quite frankly. Might be the full whammy.
He's the full sort of Gordian knot of
He's a grand slam, baby. Where were we when we were like, we need to say what Alan Dulles did during the war?
Yeah. I was about to endeavor to outline his post-war efforts to get back into the spying game.
Yes.
It's funny we were talking about him being an old man and whatever. Like even at this point, he was referred to by a sort of collection of spying former collaborators as the old man kind of thing, and they would sort of gather together at his law firm and sort of like have drinks and talk about the good old days. But Alan Dulles certainly not willing to be out of this game yet.
Oh, absolutely not.
Particularly because of his fixation with what he thought was the coming conflict with the Soviets, and that America needed a much more robust and offensive as opposed to defensive, although it was obviously offensive in a lot of other ways.
No, sure.
Needed to go on the offense against the Soviets sort of swiftly and preemptively. He became a very strong advocate for the requirement for America to develop a independent and robust sort of like
a strong man's approach.
Well, yeah, but like a spying apparatus.
Sure.
A sort of like intelligence industry, basically what would become the CIA.
Yes.
But a very particular type of agency, which was, as I say, robust, went on the offensive easily, independent in a lot of ways, like given a very free rein and a free hand. And although he wasn't responsible for the creation of the CIA, which was created in 1947 as part of the National Security Act, he did manage to get himself or he was promoted to be on a committee which reported a year later in 1948 about what usage this new intelligence agency ought to be put to, I suppose. And this report put forward very much a sort of like Dulles vision of what American sort of like counter-communist or counter-intelligence or intelligence activities ought to be, which was very much like a taking off the gloves approach kind of thing.
Yeah. Using some of our allies in Europe.
Yeah.
To do the same things.
Yeah, good chaps, I'm sure. So yeah, FDR and Truman had a huge amount of disdain for the Dulleses.
Sure.
FDR in particular, and then Truman after took over the presidency and maintained this degree of sort of antipathy to their ideas.
Truman come the 60s, particularly maybe in December of 1963, would have some things to say about Allen Dulles specifically.
And so obviously Truman was not inclined to put the CIA to these uses.
Yeah.
Truman really wanted the CIA purely to report information to the president, to the Joint Chiefs, so that they could make the decisions on what actions ought to be taken. And I can't remember the particular phraseology he used, but he really warned against the threat that a clandestine and unaccountable CIA might pose, or the kind of activities that it might put itself to.
It's easy to follow that logic too, right? Because it's like if you have an agency whose goal is to do like clandestine intelligence gathering, it's really easy if you're in charge of that agency to just go, sorry, we actually can't talk about that right now. We can't tell you about this. This is something that we can't tell anybody about. Can't tell Congress. It'll endanger the operation. And that just gives you a free rein. So it's exactly what wound up happening.
Yeah, definitely. But Dulles, given this sort of snub by Truman, basically just went and set up his own sort of shadow intelligence agency, operating ostensibly inside of the sort of State Department apparatus, but basically escaped accountability in exactly the ways he wanted the CIA to operate, kind of thing. Try and find what's the name of the organization that they set up.
Is this the one that they set up
just
in
just
the
gross.
Cupboard? They're like set up in some like closet.
Yeah, I mean, they start meeting at like in a soundproof like room or something like that. Basically, they just start operating like they are running an intelligence agency. And this is like Dulles and lots of collaborators of his from his sort of wartime OSS days. And they begin to sort of like recruit people in Western Europe. A lot of ex-Nazis they begin to recruit to be sort of agents of theirs. And I think like by the end of the 40s, they're operating this sort of like pseudo-independent spy ring, which basically has about 3,000 employees and another like 1,500 sort of like contracted people. And they're engaged in all sorts of stuff. They're engaged in, and one of the almost more benign things that they do is collect a huge amount of money and funnel it to the Italian Christian Democrats in an effort to ensure that the Italian Communist Party lose the sort of elections in 46, which is exactly what happens. But the book alludes to them being involved in far more serious activities, almost going to assassinations, although it doesn't specify who they assassinated.
Terrorist acts, especially in Italy. I mean, one of the things that they would do was...
This is before the CIA in the 40s, you mean?
Yeah. Well, yeah, kind of all throughout Italy's history, though, specifically, is like they would fund operations with like fascist groups or like at least, very least, far-right groups where they would fake communist attacks on the public, which like, okay, that doesn't make any sense. And they go, God damn communists. They blew up a train station at one point. They would just go around assassinating people and being like, this is what communists do, man. You believe that? And that kind of shit, I mean, that worked, right? I mean, what's the guy's name? The pervert who's in charge of Italy forever. What's the guy's name? The bald fat guy. I think he went to prison for a little while.
Berlusconi.
There you go. The bald fat pervert.
Yeah. I mean, your description is apt. I was just like, it sounds like he's talking about Berlusconi, but he wasn't. He didn't rule Italy in the 30s. Or in the 40s, sorry. Right?
Sure, but he directly came out of these groups that were founded by, this was its genesis, right? He directly came out of these groups that were like funded by foreign money.
So, yes, the wonderfully benign name of the organization that they were operating was the Office for Policy Coordination inside the State Department. And one of the more outlandish and also dastardly and also incredibly effective operations they ran was one called Operation Splinter Faction. And this is where enters our naive and well-meaning person who was used thoroughly by the Dulleses, a story which was going to repeat itself through history, I think. So and also enter another collection of nice Quakers.
Yeah, always getting the short end of the stick.
Who are going to receive another short end of the stick. Particularly a story that revolves around a guy called Noel Field, who Dulles quite spectacularly sold down the river, really quite intentionally, despite having quite a long history with him. Somebody who he'd met during the First World War when Field was still a young boy, and Alan Dulles had been quite taken by him. Dulles had asked what Field would like to do when he grew up, and Field had responded, "I want to work toward world peace." And he had become somebody who was a very committed and avowed pacifist, after having seen sort of like both the sort of like caravans of wounded soldiers that were coming through Switzerland at the time, and then also his dad took him on a tour of the battlefields of Europe immediately after World War One, which was definitely going to cement one sort of like pacifistic leanings. He ended up working for the State Department in America, but also this is in the 30s, and this is partly where this story sort of intersects with the idea of the degree to which socialist leanings in the 20s and 30s sort of had a degree of normalcy kind of thing. Like he was somebody who clearly had socialist leanings, never joined the Communist Party, but sort of like interacted with that sort of like milieu, I suppose. He taught himself Russian so that he could read Lenin and Stalin in the original. And eventually his sort of like communist leanings become apparent to a sort of like a Soviet spy, and he sort of ends up sort of like passing information to the Soviets and spends a little bit of time as a Soviet spy, but eventually decides he needs to eschew that life because he desperately wants to remain neutral. He wants to remain an American, but also somebody who has sort of like leanings toward the Soviet Union, because he's just a nice, quite.
He's a do-gooder.
Yeah, he's just a do-gooder.
This is a pro do-gooder podcast, all right? Say what you will, pro do-gooder podcast.
But then during the Second World War, he's working in sort of like as some kind of relief agency in Switzerland, and starts to feed information. Another person who's feeding information to Alan Dulles.
Sure.
In actual fact, he and his wife adopt a German refugee, I think, a young girl, and she ends up cycling weapons over the border into France to deliver them to French resistance fighters there. So people who have a strong working relationship with Alan Dulles. So when it is suggested to Alan Dulles in the late 40s that when it's discovered that Field is intending to go for a job interview in Switzerland, that what they might do is, through a double agent that they have in Poland, feed to the Soviets and therefore to Stalin the idea that Frank Field is in fact the head of a spy ring. The intention being, and it works out probably better than they intended. The idea is that they're going to seed in the brain of Stalin the idea that there is this massive spy ring operating against the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, and what they will instill is even greater paranoia in Stalin than already exists in his head, and it will lead to this tremendous purge across Eastern Europe, seeking out all of the agents of this non-existent spy ring. And it works entirely as they intended. Yeah. And not only does Noel Field get captured in the Czech Republic and spend 5 years in prison, his wife and his brother both go looking for him through contacts that they have in Poland, and they're both arrested and spend 5 years. And then the aforementioned adopted daughter goes sort of cycles into East Germany in an effort to reconnect with people that she knows in an office over there, and she's arrested and spent 5 years in a Soviet gulag, until the death of Stalin, and it's basically revealed that spying and this plot never existed at all, and it was all the influence and machinations of Alan Dulles and his collaborators. So for me, a telling story when it comes to Alan Dulles' willingness to use people without any regard for what it might mean for anybody's life, regardless of the prior relationships that he has with them, but also in this case, the degree to which it's quite a successful plot in a lot of ways. It basically very nearly leads to the collapse of the Czech economy. There are hundreds of thousands of people arrested across Eastern Europe. 170,000 Czech Communist Party members are interrogated. Anybody who basically ever had any connection to Frank Field's wartime activities, which were quite extensive because he was working as some kind of relief agent kind of thing. So yeah.
Pro-Quaker podcast. Always trust Quakers.
Always trust the do-gooders, especially if you're Joseph Stalin.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, too. I mean, obviously, this was played off in America as, like, Stalin at it again, baby. Which, you know, not going to go into that, but, like, disaster all around. Complete disaster. And the personal level of this poor Quaker and his lovely, presumably beautiful family, and a disaster for the Soviet Union and for the people who lived under it. Absolutely. And again, just shows it's just evil. It's just absolutely evil. And it's just this paranoia of like the Cold War beginning and people being like, intelligence, I guess that's got to be the new thing. Like the Americans are recruiting Nazis. So we got to figure out what we're going to do. We got to come back. And it's just all spirals out of control. And Alan Dulles, say what you will, smart cookie, that guy. If you're willing to completely eschew morals, you know, look into some of the other stuff he does. It's even worse. But like, my God. That was, I mean, maybe we should say we don't know about all of these plots that failed, but that one, successful.
Yeah. A triumph of ruthless amorality.
Absolutely.
I would say.
And so, yeah, as you say, the CAA goes from being this thing that was founded originally to just give the president information to this absolutely clandestine, out of control, doing whatever it wants agency, ostensibly part of the state that is able to access state funds, but is also getting off the books funds from a number of illegal activities, including selling drugs and probably just stealing money as well, but also presumably from the private sector in America as well. I mean, well, you know, define private sector, but like capitalists nonetheless. I mean, these people were all operating. It's not like after World War II, Dulles was like, I don't want any of my Sullivan and Cromwell friends to call me ever again. He's doing all of these things for the specific goal of making people at home a lot of money and stopping communism, which tied pretty closely together.
Do you want to talk about one of California's most beautiful children?
Should we talk about California's most beautiful children soon? But should we talk about one of America's most drunkest men first as a way of introducing one of California's most beautiful boys?
Okay.
The drunkest man in history, ladies and gentlemen. You probably know him from American history books as that time that we got a little bit too much like the Crucible, or I guess other way around maybe. But our lovable Scotch drinking boy, Joseph McCarthy. He enters this story as someone who, I'll be honest, I have a bit of a hard time reading. Because, ostensibly, it's easy to read the McCarthy story as somebody who's set up by people like the Dulleses, by private interests, and, of course, the state as well, to squash anything that even reeks of communism in the United States. Squash unions, squash, radical progressives, anything like that. Film directors who, went to a party once where somebody was wearing red, and red, that's a communist color, arrest everybody there. It's easy to read his story as that. But as this book makes clear, as McCarthy's reign of anti-communists call everybody before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and if not arrest them, humiliate them for being even remotely left, that spiraled out of control pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. And as this book makes clear, the people who set him on anything with a modicum of left-wing activity began to regret it. Is that fair to say?
I would say so. Yeah.
Especially one John Foster Dulles, author of the War Guild Clause. And maybe we should say this whole time John Foster Dulles has been a State Department guy, and he's been kind of like a mover and shaker in the more political ends of things, whereas Alan Dulles has been the spy brother.
Yeah. It almost feels like Alan Dulles has been groomed for this role basically his entire life. There is a degree to which the Dulles family almost lays claim to the role of Secretary of State and a connection to the connection to that department, I suppose. And it's almost like a family heirloom.
Yeah, wasn't his? I'm just looking it up now. Wasn't his the grandfather and his uncle both served as Secretary of State? So absolutely.
Yeah. And there is this sense between the two Dulles brothers that like John Foster is entitled to be Secretary of State, and Alan Dulles is entitled to be head CIA chief, basically. And they're the roles that they expect to have, and so much of their maneuverings and machinations are all designed to get themselves to the point where they can take on those two roles, kind of thing, and therefore instill their vision of what American foreign policy ought to be, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and domestic policy as well, as we see with our drunk boy.
Sure. Yeah. It's not. It's really worth fixating on and pointing out quite how useful the idea of anti-communism becomes in this period, and it's not just. It's not just sort of like Senator McCarthy's reign of terror that sort of extends between like 1950 and 1954 kind of thing, but the House Un-American Activities Committee predates him and has a significant committee member in the form of Richard Nixon, and like even Richard Nixon's first political campaign against Jerry Voorhees, it becomes very apparent to all involved, not just Nixon, and not just to his victims, not just his victim Voorhees, but also to the Dulleses and the cabal of people around the Dulleses, quite how useful it will be to purge all of these former New Dealers from government, or not even if they're not in government anymore, but to destroy their reputations, to sort of create this spectre and spectacle of secret communists hiding throughout the government, hiding throughout American institutions. And at the root of all of these purges, particularly the ones that they take particular interest in, is usually some personal desire to advance some sort of personal interest of one kind or other, kind of thing.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, I don't know. It's important to kind of realize, as we were saying earlier, that when we talk about the New Deal consensus, this is like 5 years after World War II ended. This is 5 years after FDR died and was like, yeah, you're right, we have to get rid of every Republican ever. That's not what he said, but you know what I mean. So like, this was a pretty concerted and pretty successful effort at getting rid of, well, we should say they replaced the term New Dealer with communist. And if you were Voorhees, you were a communist. If you were, anybody who smacked of not the Wall Street establishment, although we'll get to what happened later, you were a communist, right?
One of the things that really tickled me in this story of the Nixon-Voorhees contest was one of Nixon's strategies was for his operatives, I suppose, to cold call people and just say, basically the line was, this is a friend of yours. I can't identify myself, but don't you know Joe Voorhees is a communist?
I'd be like, damn, nice, Jerry.
Well, quite, yeah. That would intrigue us to vote for him. We'll be on board. But apparently spreading. Well, basically, like relentlessly calling somebody a communist, regardless of their actual political connections, it turns out wins you elections in America.
Wins you elections. Get rid of those damn New Dealers.
Yeah.
And I mean, we should say what winds up happening with McCarthy is obviously it spirals way out of control. And do you have the stat that you shared with me before we started recording, Dan, about how many people from the State Department wound up getting sacked?
So it wasn't the State Department, but eventually Senator McCarthy turns his gaze on the State Department. And this is at a time when, after the election of 52, after the election of Eisenhower, John Foster Dulles is now head of the State Department, and Foster Dulles basically acquiesces to letting this purge, this witch hunt, run rampant through the institution that he now represents. And one of the sub departments of the State Department, which comes under particular scrutiny, is Voice of America, which was America's like European propaganda arm.
Yeah.
What I assume is equivalent to the British World Service. And the stat is, of its 1,400 employees, after the McCarthyist purge, fully 870 of them, including its director, have lost their jobs. That's
and let's make it clear,
50%.
These were not really New Dealers.
No. Yeah, not people who had any particular connection to like substantial policies of FDR. They hadn't fulfilled like significant positions in any government departments, kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, clear too that this happens because McCarthy runs out of people who he can reasonably claim might have something to do with communism, then might have something to do with the New Deal, then might be kind of just a Democrat, and then he's just like, I'm still going, I'm drunk, I don't know, I'm drinking a bottle a day, baby.
There is a point also when his I don't know what role he fulfills, his assistant?
Roy Cohn, ladies and gentlemen, who you probably heard quite a lot of in the last 7 years. I didn't know that.
So this is the same Roy Cohn is currently or very recently, because you told me he was Trump's lawyer, but I was like, it couldn't possibly be now. He must be. We must be talking like in the 80s.
He died in the 80s. Yeah.
Oh, right, okay. Yeah. But he is of significance now.
Just because he was the one who set Trump. Okay, so we do need to
go off.
Yeah, we do need to have kind of an important conversation here, which is that when there are times, Dan, when you talk about events that took place, that is really easy to come across as like a loony conspiracy theorist. But the reason that happens sometimes is because of things like this. It's because it's the same people showing up over and over again in like, Oliver North, the guy who was involved in effing Iran-Contra, wound up running the NRA under Trump. It's like these people, there are just a group of people. Oh, I don't want to say it's a group of people. There's a small selection of people who keep coming up throughout history. And Roy Cohn is one of these people. And Nixon's one of these people. It's like the reason that these people, the Eastern establishment, latched onto Nixon is because they went, now here's a dude who will just do anything to lick our boots. We'll get to Nixon in a second. I don't want to ruin that. But it's like McCarthy had both Roy Cohn, who went on to be Trump's lawyer, on his team as like his second in command, and Nixon. It's like, it's important to understand that when you talk about some of these things, it can sound crazy, but that's just the nature of the system operating as it should. Because it's like a boys' club. It's just these people keep showing up, and it drives you insane throughout this entire book. You're like, wait a minute, that was the guy who was working with the Nazis in World War II, and now he's in Guatemala, and now for some reason he's in Dealey Plaza. Wait a minute, what? Like, I don't know. It's just it's important to realize that, like, I don't know, that this is not crazy. It's just the system operating as it should, in that if you are willing, as Nixon was, as Roy Cohn was, as the Dulleses were, to just submit yourself to capital, you're going to keep coming up in some of the most dastardly events in American history.
The most committed American simps for capital keep showing up.
Exactly.
There you go.
And yeah, again, to calm down a little bit, Nixon served as the connection between the Dulleses and between the Eastern establishment to McCarthy, and he was kind of supposed to be the one that they could deal with.
There was multiple occasions when they set Nixon with the task of reining McCarthy in.
He just completely fails at like he's failed at literally everything in his entire life. I hate to say it, but Nixon is such a duck. Like, just go back and watch videos of him trying to speak. It's like, oh my God, this guy.
Yeah, why was that? Why was he considered to be such a successful and competent politician?
Well, I think
because he somehow managed to chart the course between pretending to be. Maybe it's because he doesn't come from this privileged background, right? He's so desperate to get in with this crowd of sort of like Eastern establishment New York lawyers Princeton alums that he will basically just do anything for it.
Exactly,
But he does also seem to be able to both pass himself off as the everyman, but also be thoroughly in the pocket of all of these characters.
Opportunist.
Yeah,
The only word for Nixon. Complete opportunist.
I mean, he all but admits that all of his anti-communist rhetoric is opportunism because that's how he wins elections, kind of thing.
Sure, absolutely.
There's a quote after he's defeated Voorhees. He is confronted by a sort of like Voorhees representative who's basically confronting him about the things he said about Voorhees. And Nixon says to this representative, "Of course I knew Voorhees wasn't a communist, but I had to win the election, and you do whatever you need to do to win elections, and anything else is naive."
Yeah.
An interesting quote in 1946, reflecting on the rest of Nixon's career.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah. So, I mean, yes, let's talk about California's most beautiful boy. Something that I will never be able to cleanse myself of, Dan, I've told you this before, is that the way that Nixon's career has started is that a group of businessmen get together in California. And they basically say there's this guy in Orange County, which is really funny because that's not what Orange County would be now. They say there's this guy in Orange County who's causing a lot of problems for businessmen, and that's Jerry Voorhees, right? He's talking about nationalizing oil. Whoa, we're not gonna, deal with that. What we need is the most bribable, lick-splittle-esque, just disgusting toad of a human to just be paid by us to then run against him and just will do anything to win and will do what we want once he's in office. That, of course, winds up being Nixon. But the thing that disgusts me, Dan...
Should we have a look under the nearest rock to see who we find lurking there?
Well, I hate to say it because it's going to be me.
Oh, right. Oh, I see. I've forgotten this part of the story.
because the place that these businessmen met to organize this career of Nixon's, to almost literally pass around a hat to just get a bunch of money, was the hotel that I used to work at when I was in high school when I needed a summer job. And they probably had these conversations at the pool that I used to work, which makes me want to vomit. It's like, wait a minute, I worked for this place? I read that in the book, and I
maybe the
dropped
closest
it.
place you've been geographically to American history.
Exactly, yeah. I was like, no! Probably served one of these people's grandkids.
Okay, but I was suggesting a different rock.
Oh, okay.
To find lurking underneath it a different, significantly more sinister character in the story.
Thank you.
One Alan Dulles.
What do you know?
Who do you think it was that put all of these rich businessmen up to promoting Richard Nixon in this campaign?
It wasn't me. I wasn't born yet. I wasn't at the pool.
Initially in this book, the suggestion is, the narrative is begun with the suggestion that Alan Dulles and Richard Nixon meet on a fact-finding mission to Europe in like 1946 or something, in an effort to convince Nixon that Truman's plans for post-World War II European development, what would become the Marshall Plan, were something that he ought vote for. But a little later in the narrative, it becomes apparent that, in actual fact, Alan Dulles and Richard Nixon have had a previous encounter when Richard Nixon was still a naval officer. At the end of the war, basically, he came into receipt of a certain collection of documents and cables, amongst which he found some highly incriminating evidence of Alan Dulles and his connection to certain of his aforementioned Nazi connections, Nazi activities, some of the funneling of Nazi wealth that he was doing into America. And it was at this point that Richard Nixon and Alan Dulles struck up a deal that Alan Dulles would support Richard Nixon's campaign to be the congressman from Orange County if it were to be the case that Richard Nixon would disappear, shall we say, certain of this incriminating evidence.
What do we think those documents were? You think it was just like, dear Nazi, here's $50.
Thank you
for Alan Dulles. He's like, I thought I burned that one.
So yeah, I mean, it's fair to say that Alan Dulles also had reason to want to get rid of Jerry Voorhees for very similar reasons that Jerry Voorhees wanted to launch a probe into these people and their history
absolutely.
with the Nazis.
Yeah. And I think let's take one further step back in history to talk about psychoanalyzing. Get your psychoanalysis book out because we're going to psychoanalyze Nixon. Nixon is I think he's from Whittier. He went to Whittier College. Whittier College, great school. All of these people that we're talking about in the Eastern establishment either went to Yale or another Yale, Harvard, I don't know, whatever the other ones are, but mainly Yale. And if you really wanted to be one of the big boys, you had to be a Yaley, basically. Mm-hmm. And all the people at Sullivan and Cromwell who were making these moves, the DuPonts, the Bushes, all of these people, they were all part of this club, this very specific club. This was before, as we talked about with Mike Davis, before there were kind of these centers of capitalists that could compete with the Eastern establishment. This is where these people were. Nixon wanted to be part of these people, part of this gang, but he went to Whittier. Come on, you're not going to be part of the gang if you went to Whittier, Nixon. Of course not. And so there's an amazing point in this book where he relates a young, probably beautiful Richard Nixon sitting in the lobby of Sullivan and Cromwell, hoping for an interview with the law firm, and he really Talbot really feels himself with this. He's his feet dug into the thick, luxurious carpet, and he saw the fine oak paneling on the walls, and basically they didn't even offer. They were like, "Could you please leave? We're not going to interview."
He managed to get the interview. He didn't meet with Phyllis or anybody like that.
Get out of here.
No way, no way.
Whittier
but
boy.
not before he was significantly or sufficiently enamored with the entire environment.
Yeah.
And always seemed to believe that that was the place where he belonged. And that was what was most ironic about this meeting that happened in this Ojai hotel, was that it seemed to have been prompted by the fact that Richard Nixon was he was willing to run for office, but he was loath to accept such a small salary, based on the premise that he would be able to get lead a much more lucrative career at a New York law firm
in the private sector, which is true. So that's why all these dudes at the hotel.
I mean, his previous efforts to secure himself a position at a New York law firm not gone particularly well. So it may have been a little bit of a fib on his part that he thought that he deserved all this extra cash.
Yeah, it worked though, because they literally passed around a hat and were
gave him so much money,
a lot
such
of
a big
money.
bug.
We need to pay a lot of people to call everyone in Whittier and tell them that Jerry Voorhees is a communist. So thus begins the rise of Tricky Dick. Mm-hmm. And Tricky Dick then, obviously, as you say, gets on the boat and finds these documents somehow, and gets in with Alan Dulles, which must have felt good. I hope he didn't destroy them. I hope he kind of kept them. Yeah. But probably didn't do anything with them after that. And then, yes, he gets on the McCarthy bandwagon, and I suppose it all kind of falls apart. Mm-hmm.
For Richard Nixon.
For Richard, for McCarthy, certainly.
Sure.
How did that? Did McCarthy just die? Or was he just way too drunk? Everyone was like, all right, chill out, dude.
I don't know.
Yeah, I forget.
I don't know.
Whatever happened.
I think it was just that he pissed off. I mean, I don't know. I'm just guessing now. I think he pissed off all the wrong people. I mean, maybe you can Google it and find out.
I mean,
basically, after McCarthy's gaze and ire fell upon the State Department, and he thoroughly ravaged that institution to the point where John Foster Dulles was terrified that he was going to lose his job just through the association and scandal of all of these, in air quotes, communists that he was potentially harboring. McCarthy turned his gaze upon the CIA, and Alan Dulles took a totally different strategy, which was one of total refusal to cooperate. Yeah. There was somebody that McCarthy wanted to subpoena at the CIA, and basically Alan Dulles hid this guy from McCarthy or from the people that were trying to deliver these subpoenas.
Sure.
And they sort of continually tried to subpoena other people and tried to subpoena Alan Dulles at one point. And Alan Dulles just basically refused to go and give his testimony to the committee, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think it was at this point that everybody started to dig around in their big mounds of dirt, to try and see what they could fling at different people, kind of thing. Yeah. And I think there was quite a lot of dirt that stuck to McCarthy amongst other people.
It looks like eventually the Senate censured him, and they made him stop. And then several years later, he died of hepatitis. So It's the sad ending for one McCarthy.
America's drunkest man.
America's drunkest man. Let that be a lesson, folks. However, Richard Nixon's legacy would go on. Although not without some hiccups. Certainly not without some hiccups. I don't know. Is there anything else you want to talk about?
I would like to talk about one other piece of Richard Nixon's history.
Sure.
With a heavy dose of Alan Dulles.
Okay.
Sprinkled on top.
All right.
Or sprinkled beneath,
Hit
I
me
suppose. Richard Nixon managed to get himself, thanks to Alan Dulles' endorsement and the endorsement of his New York cabal, managed to get himself on the presidential ticket of one Dwight D. Eisenhower as his vice presidential running mate. And somebody whose gaze falls upon Richard Nixon is a journalist named Drew Peterson, who uncovers several pieces of quite incriminating evidence. One relates to a slush fund that was set up for Richard Nixon.
Surprise!
Surprise! Which Richard Nixon manages to, I think, perhaps quite masterfully wriggle out of through giving of a televised public address where he's seen to defend himself quite well and give this sort of powerful speech and endear himself to the American public. And then almost days before Election Day in 1952, Pearson starts to perpetuate this new story of the connection between Richard Nixon and a Romanian oligarch.
Oh, this guy. Forgot about this guy.
By the name of Nicolae Malaxa. The suggestion is that Malaxa has paid Nixon a £100,000 bribe in the hopes of gaining Richard Nixon's help in fast-tracking his settled status in the US. Basically, he wants to move to the US and gain settled status there. And the person who put Malaxa in contact with Richard Nixon was one Alan Dulles.
Wait a minute. This guy.
Alan Dulles, who was Malaxa's lawyer and I think represented Malaxa's vast fortune, which he'd sort of like gradually sequestered into lots of bank accounts in the US and also sort of spread it all over the place, kind of thing. Like that.
Money crap.
Everybody's money crap. Exactly. Basically, the note that I wrote down was Malaxa money everywhere. So I was just like, there was just this sort of taint of it all over the place.
Just put it
Alan Dulles, incredibly implicated. From what we've already talked about already, I don't think it's too incredible to believe that Alan Dulles wanted to protect this person's ill-gotten gains, shall we say?
Sure, yeah, we could say that, yeah.
So a little bit about Nicolae Malaxa. A humble background. I think made his fortune in transportation, I think, in Romania, maybe trains or something like that. There's one very peculiar or telling, I suppose, anecdote in the book where Malaxa manages to make his way into the circles of power in Romania because he befriends the king's mistress and then manages to set his own daughter up as the mistress of the king's son, so sort of like the prince in Romania, which in the book is described as a Game of Thrones-esque maneuver. But it does the job of getting him into the circles of power, as it were, I suppose. But as the sort of rising tide of Nazism in Europe and anti-Semitism and the influence of Nazi Germany begins to spread in the 30s, there is this growing nationalist and anti-Semitic movement in Romania, who are called a not at all fascist name, the Iron Guard. It could be a Space Marine.
That's my favorite Space Marine chapter.
Who the Iron Guard eventually see to the toppling of the king and the installation of a pro-Nazi regime in Romania. Before this happens, Malaxa has already successfully managed to cut his ties with the King of Romania and literally begins to fly the flag of the Iron Guard from his castle and manages to install himself as what would seem to be like the leader of this group, or a pseudo leader of this group, or somebody who's seen to be a significant connection to it. So much so that when this coup is finally put down, he goes to prison. Worth mentioning that the Iron Guard, which he is seen to, well, clearly allied himself with and was keen to be allied with, are responsible for some really brutal pogroms.
Sure.
Which I won't sort of like tell you the details of, but like,
you know what a pogrom is,
horrific,
folks.
Horrific.
It's not good.
He is removed from power, but then somehow manages to curry the favor of the new communist regime that comes into place after the Soviet Union retake Romania.
He's making deals. He's just making deals.
And so he has this connection to both Nazism, brutal anti-Semitic acts in Romania, and then also a connection to the new Romanian communist regime. But I think he knows where the wind is blowing and knows that he really needs to get out of Romania.
What were you doing for the last 5 years?
And as we've already ascertained, Alan Dulles is someone who is amoral to his core and really only interested in protecting people's money, and is quite keen to promote and protect this person once they reach America, and puts them in contact with Richard Nixon in an effort to fast track his immigration. An immigration process which is incredibly difficult for Malexa because his list of crimes, shall we say, is basically repugnant to absolutely everybody. There is really nobody in the American establishment at all, minus Richard Nixon and Alan Dulles, it would seem, who saw any possible reason why they would want to protect this person at all. Like his CIA and FBI files were just like full of grotesque sort of activities and deeds that he'd been involved in. So he stunk to high heaven, but he successfully managed to. Well, he gave this bribe to Richard Nixon, and Richard Nixon started to make efforts to intervene on his behalf, to pull strings, to pull levers. It really wasn't going very well. They set up a phony corporation in California, which has the delightful name of the Western Tube Corporation.
They just make tubes. How bad could they be?
Which ostensibly was essential to Californian and American pipeline laying for oil, I suppose. I mean, it was a total phony corporation. It didn't exist.
California is half tubes,
but it did manage to result in a massive tax break for Malexa. Suffice to say, this aforementioned journalist Pearson had gotten hold of this story, knew that this bribe had happened, but they really couldn't successfully manage to get it to stick onto Nixon. And there was one incriminating piece of evidence out there in the world, but unfortunately Pearson couldn't get hold of it. The check that had been given to Nixon by Malexa was copied by a Romanian emigre to the US and a opponent of Malexa's, and it was handed off to somebody else, and then who eventually handed it to someone at the CIA. So the crucial piece of evidence that could have seen to basically scuppered Nixon's political career in 1953 was handed to the one person who was most keen on protecting the longevity of his career.
Which, let's be clear, not many other people cared about Richard Nixon's career.
No.
Very uncharismatic, uninteresting fellow.
So suffice to say, Alan Dulles managed to make this piece of incriminating evidence disappear. But there you go. Dastardly characters connected with even more dastardly characters engaged in underhand scheming to protect their interests at all costs and ensure that nobody sees any form of justice for any type of evil that they've engaged in.
Tell you what.
So that they could set people up in careers where they could go and do even more dastardly and evil things in the future.
Tell you what, Watergate not looking so bad.
No.
Not at all. It's just like they tap some phones. Who cares?
Again,
it's almost like these stories are written to make you go insane, because it's like, as you say, keep turning over rocks and it's just the same people. It's like Alan Dulles died presumably, I won't say happy, but presumably comfortable, and presumably never faced any kind of issues for what he's done. The stuff that we're talking about that he's done so far, I hate to say it, but pales in comparison to the stuff that he'll do in these later parts of his career when it comes to foreign policy. The amount of deaths and suffering that he is directly responsible for in various countries around the world. We'll get into that some other time, but like, again, I don't know. And unless there's something else that you kind of want to say on any like specific of these stories, like, I forget exactly what it was that we talked about a little while ago, but we said something along the lines of any kind of left-wing movement, kind of like worth its salt, needs to use like everything in its arsenal to get people to listen to them, right? And when we were having the conversation, we were talking about like parliamentarism, entryism, all that kind of stuff. But like when it comes to any movement, whether it's socialist, from progressive to communist, anarchist, whatever, if you're on the left, so much of your ideology does come down to just getting people to listen to you and getting people to understand how exploited they are and how things would work better if they controlled their own lives, basically. And there are a lot of ways to go about that. But these stories make it pretty clear who your enemies are, right? They make it pretty clear that it's not just if you're like a libertarian, it's not just the state that's making these problems. Alan Dulles wasn't doing this for the benefit of the American state, right? Obviously, it's some things he did, he was, and mainly for his own power to make his influence greater. But like, it makes it clear that your enemies are also, capitalists, and also that these capitalists will do anything they can. They'll murder you, they'll torture you, they'll make you live a life not worth living, and they'll do that to as many people as possible just to get what they want. And so when we talk about like building some kind of left-wing movement worth its salt with any amount of like a large following, all of these stories so far have made me so much more mad than obviously like any kind of value theory. Because that's not to like, be like, all we need to talk about is the conspiracy theory stuff. But it's like, obviously, the hard science stuff, the economics, all of that is vitally important to any kind of movement. But it's like, this stuff elicits such an emotional reaction for me of just disgust and anger that it's like, I can't help but thinking that these stories in some way need to be used outside of the far right as conspiracy theories, and that like as they actually exist could be of vital use to some left movement.
Yeah,
Unless
well said.
I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, there's no use in abstract economic theories if they don't actually speak to people's real existence of how they experience their day-to-day lives and toiling under capitalism. I don't know how good a job we've done necessarily of connecting like abstract theory to lived reality, although I hope that like people could start to fill in some of those things in their own lives if they so wish, or if it helps them at all. And similarly, like abstract political theory is of no use if you don't like connect it to actual political maneuverings, actual networks of power. There's no use speaking abstractly about how states operate, how political economies operate, without looking at the actual histories of those systems, of the people involved, and sort of fully understanding the array of forces that are potentially collected in opposition to you, supposing that we want to rally our own forces. And,
yeah, absolutely.
Oppose these people.
I mean, again, it's worth... If nobody talks about this stuff, as we've seen over and over and over again, the right wing just lays claim to it immediately. Whether it's the amazing man who shows up to QAnon rallies claiming to be JFK Jr. as part of this like grand bastardization of like some kind of crazy JFK conspiracy theory that stems from like real events about the Dulleses, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But like, it is worth emphasizing as much as possible that these events are the system operating as it should. These are not anomalies. This is exactly what's supposed to happen.
Yeah, I mean, if there's one conspiracy theory that's been totally taken over by the right, it's the idea of the deep state.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I think we deserve to be able to reclaim some of those ideas in some small measure, kind of thing. Like there are institutional sort of imperatives that operate below the surface that maintain sort of a degree of continuity in the system, kind of thing. And some of these people that we've talked about today are representatives of that sort of institutional sort of maintenance of power, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I kind of tend to like cringe a little bit whenever I hear like the word cabal get thrown around.
I've been throwing it around a lot.
Well, it's a good word, but like it does. I think at this point it smacks a little bit too much of conspiracy theory. But when you do realize that, like, oh, well, okay, if your definition of a like deep state is just capitalists being capitalists, like, okay, then like, yeah, I guess I agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah, or like representatives of certain government agencies who understand which interests it is that they serve.
Yeah.
And seek to support those interests dispassionately, kind of thing. I mean, it only comes back to some of the things we were reading in Miliband about the idea of the state and about the idea of class and about these arenas not being neutral ones, but one sort of like overflowing with class interest.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, even if you're trying to explain this to like the dude that you work with, like, and trying to get that person maybe to go from being like a crazy QAnon conspiracy theorist to maybe seeing the light, like John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, two of the most influential American, I hesitate to say politicians, but like people of their era. And obviously, all you need to say is, you know, if you still believe that like, you know, voting, I'll exercise my political power by voting and I'll make a change by just doing that and nothing else. None of these people were ever elected, obviously. Allen Dulles never won an election. Nixon won an election somehow. I don't know how anybody voted for Nixon. But like, yeah, I guess that just goes back to the idea of like this, you know, whenever liberals specifically have done a very good job of whenever anybody says deep state or anything like that, any kind of continuity of ideology beyond simple voting, that they make that person out to be a conspiracy theorist. But it's pretty clear here when we talk about what is and isn't a conspiracy. It's just capitalism.
Well, yeah, the idea of a deep state is so offensive to liberals because the idea from the liberal imaginary, I suppose, is that is of a pluralistic state, right? Of like all interests represented equally or having the same access to the corridors of power, I suppose, when like we already knew, but we have greater evidence now that like certain people have certain interests and certain connections to power and maintain that power ruthlessly.
Yeah.
And will do absolutely anything that they need.
Absolutely. Ruthlessly is like almost, we haven't gotten into the foreign policy stuff as we will, I would imagine, at a later episode sometime in the future, but ruthlessly almost doesn't even begin to cut it because it's like, yeah, these people helped facilitate the Holocaust and then they did it over and over and over again to people just like us, right? And they wouldn't hesitate to do it to us if it meant they would make more money either. I would just like to say that the last sentence of Nikolai Maleksa's Wikipedia page is, having apparently never applied for American citizenship, Maleksa died at his residence in New Jersey. It's just Wikipedia being like, wait a minute, how did this happen?
Yeah, it feels like there's quite a lot missing from this Wikipedia article.
Very strange. I guess he could have been a citizen.
Yeah, there's something slightly contradictory going on.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, well, I'm sure it's all fine.
Yeah,
just some kind of bureaucratic snafu.
A box wasn't checked. Well, folks, I hope you now think about something different other than cool, sweet, sugary, carbonated refreshment next time you reach for a Fanta. And that you understand that perhaps this American brand of capitalism, maybe we could do better. Maybe something else could be done because this stuff is all still continuing. As we've said, yes, this book doesn't even get into the stuff that Allen Dulles really is infamous for. Or, I mean, it does, sorry, but we haven't covered it quite yet. This is all, like, leading up to the height of his power, because he's definitely not at it yet with Nixon. But we will probably get there eventually. and God help us, we might even talk about the third part of the book. I will say, this book, you're going to have to sit through some kind of like liberalish stuff. Extraordinarily well researched, though, and written more like a novel than it's popular history, I suppose.
Yeah.
But yeah, Talbot, dude, did his homework.
Yeah, good book. Good
book, folks. Just wild, if nothing else. Anything else, Dan? I haven't even eaten dinner. I'm like,
thank you, everybody who sat through this entire thing. I don't know how long it is, but I feel like it's a long one.
Been recording for 2 hours and 15 minutes.
God.
We've
covered 2 chapters.
Yeah, we have been going off.
Maybe we'll trim it down a little bit, but yes, we commend your stamina.
Absolutely. Commend your stamina. Well done. And again, thank you to our sponsors, IBM, Coca-Cola, Chase, Ford, GM, Kodak, Dow Chemicals, Brown Brothers, Harriman, and Standard Oil. This as always has been Jack and Dan coming to you live from the Sullivan and Cromwell offices in a penthouse in, I don't know, Manhattan. I don't know. Yeah, I've been Jack. Thank you very much.
I've been Dan. Cheerio, folks.
See you next time. Oh my God. Oh my God. The music you heard this episode was Music to Kill Bad People To by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. If you like this song, you can check it out and much, much more on their Bandcamp at kinggizzard.bandcamp.com. Be sure and follow us up on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And if you liked what you heard, be sure and tune in next week for some more commie discussion. Till next time.